Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Diversified Semantic Layer podcast. This is Eric Vallo, and I'm joined by a little bit different mix of friends today. My pal Josh Fletcher is back from way over.
Hello.
He doesn't look anything like he did in the last podcast. Derek is back.
No, I'm not.
No, we chased him off.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, guys.
Yes. We knew anything that had to do with anything universe related had to include you. And then the man with the mythical beard, back once again, Dave Rathbun. Hey, Dave.
Morning.
Thanks for joining us on camera, no less.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Dave I'm gonna trumpet Dave just a moment. Sorry, everybody of AOL listserv fame and now the Bob Father.
Courtesy of Greg Myers for that title, yeah. Still working on the T-shirts.
That well deserved. So today we wanted to talk about universe design best practices, and those walk across concepts like, how do I do something technically easy to how do I do something to make sure my business is engaged, and we're gonna try and run the gamut today. But as always, we love to hear your comments, so come by dslayer.net after the show and either leave your scathing comments or, support us or give us new ideas. So that said, let's go. All right, so I think I'm going to be going back and forth to list because, there's a list. Josh, you had some comments about measure aggregation. What's your favorite? What's your best practice?
So it's a best practice. Definitely the way the universe is designed is to take advantage of database aggregation. One of the probably the challenges is if you don't define database aggregation within your measure objects. So I'm talking about like doing a sum function or doing a count function on a column in the measure. Then effectively that's not going to cause a group by in the SQL statement, and you're going to return a lot more data than you need to, right? So that may not be a big issue with small data sets, right? But if your group by from your query in Webby compresses the row count from, 10 million down to 1,000, well, all that data has to, one, get pulled out of the database, has to get transferred across the network, it has to get, pulled to the business object server, and then probably rolled up into the report. And so you're just going to get performance issues the whole way along. So best practice for me is to include database aggregation functions in all of your measures, and or anything that you're measuring. The second piece to that, though, is you also need to make sure you define the appropriate projection aggregation. So the projection aggregation is a setting on the measure object, and what that does is it effectively tells the reporting tool, so Webby as a default, it'll tell that how to further aggregate the data set when you pull out one dimensional measure or a couple of dimensions and the measure into a reporting block, a table or chart in your Webby report. So if you sum the data in, you go from 10 million records to 1,000. If you then pull out one of the dimensions in the measure, then you may be compressing it down to 10 records. How does it roll up that measure further? So both of those are critical to defining a really good measure that performs well and produces correct results. Any comments or anyone on that?
Well, maybe to say that I agree with you 1,010%. I know that I sometimes claim I have big universes, and I know that you've got my universe and you've got like Dave's universes, which are like, I don't keep going, size-wise. So what you have is when you're running this stuff along millions and millions and millions of rows, I mean, the last thing I need for my users to deal with is I'm going to bring back this million records, and why are you trying to sum that in Webby? Why do we need to not have the number 1 million? And why do you want all 1 million individual records? And then you're filling up all your back end stuff. It just gets ugly. And we, just like you said, Josh, we pretty much made it our standard practice that if you're going to have, a member ID, or in the healthcare world that I work in, or you have a dollar sign for everybody, and you're going to want to sum that. That sum's getting done, in SQL inside the universe object to throw that group by and having clause on there. It's just way too important for performance and for what's coming back. I mean, I would think that sometimes I would hope that would have been the default sometimes, magically inserted in business objects. But at the end of the day, we're kind of just like, okay, we're just going to go ahead and, watch this happen. So
I think I had one universe at a client where, and Josh, you touched on the group by clause. They had several different developers working on this universe, and some of the measures had proper functions set up. Some of them did not. And they couldn't figure out why they were getting the wrong answer. And if you think about it, a measure that doesn't have a SQL aggregate is then going to show up in the group by for something when combined with something that does have an aggregate, and then it ends up under counting. So, yeah, we went through and had to completely clean that one up. And Derek, to your point, I think if you've worked with IDT a little bit, today we have a feature where you select a bunch of objects and you right-click and you say turn to measure, and they want to immediately know what the aggregate function is. So that helps.
agreed.
And then ultimately, even back in Universe Designer, there's a setting called multiple SQL for each measure, which does not work. Even though if you've defined it as a measure, it doesn't work unless it has an aggregate. So that's a little bit of a hidden indicator that, hey, your measures probably should have an aggregate, but it is there.
Yeah, I love when we actually have statements like, it has this feature, but it doesn't work.
I never thought about that. I've never encountered the kind of some measures having aggregate function and some not, and actually causing incorrect results. That kind of adds even further weight to, you need to have just every measure should have an aggregate function.
Absolutely. Yep. That was a rather interesting project because originally I had a couple of the folks from the client come to a training class that I was doing back in my Integra days, and about every 30 minutes, I mean literally was that often, I would introduce something and they would say, well, we were told it doesn't work that way, or ours doesn't give us the right answer if we do that. And finally I said, well, what are you doing? because this is really not that difficult. And that turned into a 2-hour engagement where I went to their site and we called it a Stump Dave Day. They brought in all of their challenges in a conference room, and they took turns throwing stuff at me, and I'd throw it up on the projector, and we'd fix it. And finally I said, this is just weird. Why is your universe doing this stuff? Pulled up the universe, and that's when it was revealed that half the measures had aggregate functions, half of them didn't. And so both the volume question and the data correctness, it was just a mess. So that turned into a week of let's get this fixed. And by the end of the day, they were much happier with business objects and weren't ready to throw it out in the trash heap because they were just about to that point. Just goes to show how important that framework, that universe is. If it's messed up, you're just not going to get anything right.
I think it's safe to say if you're a universe developer and you don't understand those projections, when to appropriately not only choose to supply an aggregate within your SQL statement, but also in the properties tab of that object, whether it's going to average or sum or min or max or use database delegation, you must, or you will return the incorrect results when users try and start slice and dicing.
I have that conversation, it feels like, at least once a quarter with a user who doesn't understand why they have to do their percentages on the report. It's like, well, you know that #2 refresh thing that you told me to get rid of? Here's your alternative. You do it. So.
Yeah. So quick anecdote before we move on to the next item. What's the biggest universe that you guys have ever seen in terms of number of objects? I'd love to hear.
Oh, jeez. I'll go over here and see if I can do a count star while I'm at it. No. Over here.
File parameters.
Exactly. Where is it?
Well, I've got the biggest universe that I'm currently responsible for has over 10,000 objects. It's got over 30 facts tables, and something I think we're going to touch on a little bit later. It's got almost 70 different time frames, and so as a result, it's got, I think last time I looked, 1,620 contexts.
That's crazy.
That's you win.
Yeah. No, wait. Before you.
No, wait.
That title.
I'm not sure I win because I have to maintain that universe.
Mine's only 2/3 of that. So.
I met a customer at SBOUC last year that came to my presentation, and we were talking about universe size, and he says his universe had 33,000 objects. I said, "How's that possible, dude? Like, are you sure?"
Sure. Did you move the comma by accident, maybe? I mean, how do you find anything?
Wrong aggregation, I guess. All right.
6 different sums.
Well, if we have an 11 of these, we probably ought to get a move on.
Yeah.
So
That was just the most important one.
so Derek, you had a comment about bringing together the business and IT in universe design. What's that about?
Well, yeah, for us, it's, we've standardized on universes, and for years it was just you had one here, one there, and that was it. But now more and more people want to build their own reports. So then it's been an IT generated and managed, endeavor forever. And now the business wants to have their analysts and their shadow ITs, for lack of a better term, build their own, but it's still, they don't run their own server, so it's still on the central infrastructure. So we've gotten to the point where you've got kind of parallel tracks, where you've got universes that are designed, developed, and maintained by IT, and universes that are actually first pass developed by IT, so it meets the baseline standards, and then they take it, and at that point have their own universe developer, and they're doing their own thing. So how we're maintaining, I don't want to say control, but how we're maintaining similarity in some form of best practice is that as we've architected BI, we're bringing in folks, like myself and other folks at a subject matter expert level to work with the business developers, to work with the architects to figure out, yes, universe here makes sense. Yes, you need a second universe. You don't want to add another 2,000 objects to another 10,000 object universe. Build a new one. I know, I just popped Dave's bubble.
That crazy idea of governance.
Yeah, but you know what? I think a little bit of governance goes a long way, because the reason why to be honest, the reason why businesses build their own universes is because there's too much governance and project process on the IT side. So if you've got some folks in the middle, like a COE or a BICC or someone that can help kind of fill the gap between the two, what you've got then is the ability of having good quality universes on the business side, what we call BOAs, business-owned applications, that aren't going to crush everything and be horrible performing, but that corporate governance is there, but it's not handcuffing anybody. What it's doing is that all it's saying is, congratulations, you've got a good team and you built a good universe, keep going, or you should probably look at this, because what's going to happen when it gets to the server people are going to say, no, you can't run it. So I really think that there's a good line, a good universe doesn't have to be developed by IT, as long as the developer and the people asking for what goes in a universe can agree that they're not going to break stuff.
Man, you just gave us a reason for another entire show.
Cool.
I think any one of these topics could be a whole show.
Yeah.
I can add a little bit on to what Derek said, and it's been interesting to watch the evolution at Pepsi over the last 10 years or so, because when I first started going out there, they didn't have enterprise governance on universes. It was all done by the business. And the only thing that the enterprise team, if you will, was responsible for was making sure that the lights stayed on. So running server patches, making sure the cluster was up and going. And we had a couple of documents on best practices that we published, which everybody promptly ignored. But ultimately, then, as we started moving toward Teradata as our enterprise platform, anything that hits Teradata today does go through governance, because we are on a shared environment. We want to make sure that everybody is playing nicely with everybody else. And our three big divisions, which would be Pepsi, Frito-Lay, and then Quaker, which includes Gatorade, they're all running enterprise, if you will, silos or divisional warehouses on that big platform, and they all think they're the only ones there. That's not quite true, but they probably wouldn't admit to it, but they probably do. And so from a Teradata perspective, I kind of have the final say on what happens there, and in fact, I've developed from scratch 2 of the 3 universes, and then the third one is the one that I mentioned earlier with the 1600 context. That one I inherited. It didn't have 1600 context when I started. I brought that on myself. But we do still have businesses that have Oracle or SQL Server or even DB2 on the mainframe, and they build their own universes, and if they need help, they'll come to us. But they are absolutely the owner. I like the acronym, Derek. I may steal that, the BOA, because we absolutely do have that scenario. And for us, it works pretty well because we don't have the manpower in our group to build, maintain, and support all 200 plus of those applications that are literally all over the place as far as databases, function, scope, size. The big ones, yeah, I kind of take those, but the smaller ones or the middle-sized ones, we let the business do what they want and support them when they ask for it.
It's interesting. The customer I'm working at now, we're actually looking at that same kind of governance model. To date, there hasn't really been any central governance around the universes, and what we've got is a lot of probably universes that could be improved in design. Let's put it that way. We've got business units who are wanting to do their own development, and we're kind of having to come up with a governance plan where we can still give them some of the control around the design of the universes, but retain some of the kind of core governance and still apply design standards which at the moment don't exist. So we're standing up standards. We're then having to change that governance process to say sure, there's some core enterprises across the data warehouse that we need to manage because they're shared by everyone across the enterprise. But then when there's a departmental requirement, sure, we can meet that. You can develop it yourself, but it still needs to go through the kind of QA process with the BICC so that it's validated that it's not going to bring down the data warehouse. But we're just at the beginning of that journey. So, it's really good to hear how both of your organizations have managed that and kind of have matured that process.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the term manage it is probably a little bit optimistic because we used to, in fact, we tried 2 different times to set up what you would call a competency center, and ultimately it failed in both cases because it became process. And one of the things that people like to do is circumvent process when they think it gets in their way. So yeah, we wanted to try to help them out, build good universes, but ultimately it became a process, and that just made things take longer. So we're still trying to figure out how we can help without being obtrusive.
Well, and I think that obtrusiveness is probably the biggest, elephant in the room, because what it is that you want to be there, you want to help, but you're right. It's the fact that IT's coming or the COE's coming, and they're going to tell us we can't do this, and that's not generally the case. It's the fact that we're trying to nip it in the bud. So if you try to actually put that thing into the development environment, and the admins do their overview, and then they freak out when you didn't use going back to our first topic, you didn't use measure aggregations, and your reports are going, your Webby reports are going to pull back the entire billion row table. Yeah, then they're going to flip their lids, and that's when that IT overlord comes into play. And hopefully, by partnering and working together earlier, you don't have that. And I think that's the bonus of it, is that if you could do that a couple times and show the positive outcome, then that overlordness hopefully gets nipped in the bud a little bit. And that's all I was going with the topic a little bit, was how, if you could move the process forward, make things a little better. At the end of the day, it's a little less do what I say. It's let's work together.
I think that's such a great point, Derek. It's as always, it comes down to communication. And if you just wait until they bring you a universe and you catch it when it needs to go to test, and you're just like, well, no, this is a terrible design, and go back and rewrite it, and they just spent 6 weeks building it. Well, you're not winning any friends, right? But if you're actually trying to actually engage with them up front and go, tell us when you have a universe and let us help you, and let us provide that SME experience so that we can help you build something that's going to meet your requirements and is going to play nice with everything else, and it's a journey and a partnership together. I get, it's easy to pick the one that's going to put you on good working relationship or good terms with the business, right?
To me, just to break it down simply, governance needs to be a process in which doesn't drive the business back to shadow IT.
Yeah.
And it's an inevitability that it's a risk, where you give the business an opportunity to develop their own universes, but you tell them, I have to review it every time, and that is the reason that I wish there were more application controls built into business objects, into the universe, and into the platform as a whole, so I could keep tabs, report, and control what's happening. Moving us along, because I had to have the last word. No. Shortcut joins are often abused, and Dave's going to talk about how you use shortcut joins like a boss.
There you go. A couple years ago, I included this in one of my presentations at the BO conference, and I always introduced it by saying, I know you're supposed to love all of your blog posts equally, but the blog post that I did on shortcut joins is probably my favorite one I've ever written. It just kind of flows. But the thing that happens with shortcut joins is, if you put in a shortcut join to break up a context, it makes it think that it works because the loop goes away. But shortcut joins are not supposed to be for context resolution. That's one of my big pet peeves when I go in and look at a universe somebody has built and there's shortcut joins all over the place. And the bottom line that I tell these folks and anybody who would be doing universe design is, if your universe doesn't work without shortcut joins, it's not going to work with shortcut joins. You have to get everything working and functional first, and then you can go back and you can add in shortcut joins for what their purpose is, which is to improve performance by allowing you to jump over tables that aren't needed. So that's really the short and sweet of it, is that if you've got a universe that has shortcut joins in it and you're not sure if they're done correctly, take them out. And if the universe breaks, then they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. But that's ultimately what's going on, is that they were there so that I can skip from table A to table C, not to break up a loop. See, short and sweet, shortcut join, short topic.
I like cheating, but whatever, Dave.
I'm shaking my finger at you.
Yeah, but
do you find, Dave, in terms of shortcut joins, do you find that you tend to use them very much with a dimensional model, or they're more used for a third normal form, kind of like OLTP database structure?
So if I'll jump right to the detailed piece there. Star schema, no, you don't typically use them, but our first big universe that we built on Teradata was heavily snowflaked. And in that case, yes, absolutely, it makes a difference. As long as you've got the snowflake dimension key down in your fact table, we were able to use that to great effect to improve performance, in some cases dramatically. And yes, they are much more common in an application style model, a third normal form, if you will, but they are present in a warehouse model. And in fact, one of my points in my blog post was, there's a setting in the universe parameters about how shortcuts are interpreted, because by default, and they change this every other version, it seems like, so maybe it's not the default anymore, but in some cases the query path generator, so the SQL generator engine, is only going to look at one shortcut at a time. And in a snowflake model, it should be able to look at all of the shortcuts, because they may be coming from different directions. One's coming through the time hierarchy, one's coming through the product hierarchy, one's coming through the geography hierarchy. So they're all independent of each other. In order to get the SQL generator to use all of the shortcuts at once, you have to change the parameter to global rather than successive. Successive meaning I'm going to do it one at a time, to global meaning I'm going to take an overall view of the universe and say, yeah, I can use this shortcut because it's independent of these others. But good point for bringing that up. Thanks, Josh.
So I think it's completely related, or maybe completely, just tangentially. Josh, one of your points was about loop resolution with context and aliases, and, well, Dave says don't use a shortcut join. What what's your best practice there?
Well, I think it comes down to people, universe developers understanding, one, how they get loops in their universe. And if you work with universes for some time, then you'll have created loops, which is just multiple paths to join the tables, right? And quite often one of the common occurrences is when you have two dimensions across, or two dimensions shared across two facts, and you're going to get like this circular reference between how do I join dimension A to dimension B? Do I do it through fact 1 or through fact 2? And when it comes down to it, I think some universe developers, as I've seen on forums or in sessions I presented, they look at aliases and contexts as two alternatives to resolving a loop, and they maybe don't understand that they both solve different problems. An alias tends to resolve probably a shared dimension or a shared kind of snowflake across two dimensions. So the typical example from motors in the universe training is I have a country dimension that's shared between my customer, so the country the customer's from, or the showroom country. And so that
date would be a very common.
Exactly. So by aliasing those, I refer to only the country that the customer's from, or only the country that the showroom is in, and so I resolve that one loop. But then contexts are used when I have to primarily resolve paths through different fact tables. I can't actually remove those joins without disconnecting the schemas completely, and then I can't query across the dimensions. I can't actually query both fact tables at the same time, which is one of the major benefits of multi-path reporting or SQL generation. So really, a context is just a path through the tables, and Dave, you'll have to refresh me if I kind of get stuck, but there's really kind of three different cases where the context is used. One where I maybe pick one of the dimensions and one of the fact tables, like so a dimension and measure object, and then it can infer which context to use. So I don't get prompted for the context in the query. Another one might be where they're incompatible. So I choose one dimension object and a measure from both fact tables. And in that case, what Business Objects does is actually generate two subqueries and then join them with a full outer join. So again, I don't get prompted for the context. The only time I get prompted for the context is in the third situation, which is where there's, and I've forgotten the name of it, but it's basically
ambiguous.
Ambiguous, thank you. Is where I maybe grab a dimension from the first dimension and a second dimension object from the second dimension, and I don't choose a measure. So a good example would be, do I grab country and showroom together? Am I looking for showrooms, customer and showroom? Am I looking for showrooms where a car was sold to that customer or where they were rented to that customer? And in that case, that's the only time where a user gets prompted for a context. So I think they're a really great way of providing multiple paths through the loops. And the user really only gets prompted very, very rarely in that one situation where there's an ambiguous query. Otherwise, the SQL generation can use what you've defined by the context to generate the correct SQL. Sorry, that was really long-winded, but it's a really interesting subject. And a lot of people don't understand the depths of that, which is a shame, I think.
I'm sorry, I fell asleep.
That's gonna need its own show, brother.
That's I'm kidding. And I think you're right, Josh, in the fact that it is interesting because there is way too many, and it's not saying that's a bad thing, but there's way too many opportunities to do it badly that just cause irreparable harm, mainly to your psyche as you try to figure out what in the heck these people were thinking. So you've always had, and there's always that context versus alias discussion that everyone seems to love to have. And I see Dave nodding because I know that him and I have had this this same conversation 100 different times, online, in person, probably telepathically as we work.
It comes up on Bob about once every 2 or 3 months. What's the best answer in the context or alias? And as Josh alluded to, but put very succinctly, there is no best answer, but there is a correct answer. So you got to understand that they're not interchangeable. I think is where Josh was going, is that you don't get to pick one or the other. You look at the problem, you determine the proper solution, and you apply it. And that's hard for some folks to grasp because I think partially if they had the benefit of going to training, maybe the instructor didn't quite get it and didn't emphasize that well enough. And that's something I always tried to do when I was training, was make sure folks understood this isn't really an option. When you look at and this is where cardinalities come into play. You don't need cardinalities to generate SQL. The SQL logic doesn't change because it's a one-to-many versus a many-to-one or a one-to-one or whatever cardinality you have. But those are indicators to the designer that says, hey, this is, to Josh's point, this is a central path. This is a query path decision I have to make because these are shared fact tables, or these are alternate fact tables with shared dimensions, versus this is a lookup table. And I think I heard somebody mention date. Account number is another one that comes up a lot in financial situations, and the country, of course, from the Motors universe. And you forgot maker. I wanted to put that in there. It's actually used 3 times. So,
yeah, that's right.
Yep. And
I was trying to be succinct.
Have you been on this podcast before?
One of the blog posts that I tried to summarize this, I described context and aliases, or well, context specifically, as a train ride home. You have 2 destinations. You have work and you have home, and maybe you're taking the train, but you have 2 paths. You can go one or the other. You have to choose one, and on one path, you can pick up a newspaper on the way home, and on the other path, you can pick up a gallon of milk. So that's your context prompt, is do you want milk or do you want a newspaper? Or if you want both, you have to make 2 trips. So the algorithm, or the analogy kind of falls apart a little bit, but it kind of helps me present it when I can draw train stations on the board and describe it to folks.
So to take this conversation in a little bit different direction, I'm one of those rule breakers. So I have a use case in which I actually like to abuse contexts and ag awareness as a hack.
Yeah.
And that's in historical versus current reporting. For some reason in my career, I've run into this situation 10 too many times. And in that situation, I have like HANA does a great job for handling hot versus cold storage for history and current records. Sometimes you have to solve for that in a universe as well. Maybe you're not so lucky that you're only separated by a partition, and instead you've got different tables. And so the way I've solved for that in the past is, you know what, I have an object in my universe, and I use aggregate awareness, even though I may not be trying to crawl from one level of aggregation to another. I'm simply trying to use aggregate awareness to change between a current view of my data and a historical view of my data. The second approach to that is that instead of the cumbersome context prompt box, I'm forcing those compatibilities with just a filter. Hey, by default, since my current views always come first in my aggregate awareness statement in my SQL, I'm always going to get the current view by default. But a user has to consciously say all historical records, and the context will change over to the historical data and make that data available for reporting. And so it's probably one of those that is also where they have a show dedicated, but it's not the way I think contexts were necessarily intended to be used. But I think it simplifies reporting where you've got that scenario of split tables or for the current versus historical reporting.
How do you, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I was going to say I'll give you a segue here, because one of the basically at the root, a context is designed to give you separate SQL statements, and we use that also to present a very user-friendly environment for our users with regard to time frames. So if you're looking at month to date and year to date, and you're looking at current year and prior year, well, those are 4 different contradictory date ranges. And in theory, the user could throw the measure up on the query panel and create 4 different query passes. But we have an option to do that using context as well, as long as we can put each one of those time frames into a different path. So that's, if you were to look at the cardinalities, the way the tables were put together, I touched on that earlier, the way we've implemented the time frames for our universes would kind of indicate that all of those time frame tables are aliases and therefore can all be used together, but we force them into separate contexts, which means then the user can throw as many measures as they want on the query without regard to what times are being requested. And I don't know, I imagine a lot of companies are like this. We can't we can't tie our shoes without asking how we did it last year. So everything is compared current year to prior year, and that's immediately 2 query passes. We ended up with 6 or 8 queries per document as a quite common occurrence, but the user never knows that. They just throw the objects on the query, and using context and aliases and some other magic, it all just works, which is a beautiful thing.
So if Dave says it's okay to hack, it's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well, that was a nice little string of sort of related things, I guess.
Nice when a plan falls together.
It's almost like we meant to do that or something. So I'm gonna flip one over to Josh because this is near and dear to my heart right now. Josh is going to talk a little bit about data federation in the multi-source universe, the holy grail that we've been waiting for 20 years.
Oh. Are you sure you want me to talk again? Monologue.
You got 15 minutes. Go.
Go. I think it's a really exciting piece of capability. I mean, so it's a data federator engine, which used to be licensed separately, and they've embedded it in the multi-source universe, in the which you can build in the information design tool. And effectively, it allows you to query multiple data sources, to bring those tables in and to join them. And then, obviously, your query engine, whether it's Webby or Crystal or Explorer, whatever, can query across those multiple data sources. So at a starting point, that's really great being able to pull multiple sources. But obviously, you've got some performance considerations because now you can't push down a lot of the SQL to one source and optimize the SQL. So a lot of the results have to come back to the business objects federation engine and then combine them before it can serve them up. So that's where you introduce the data federation administration tool, DFAT, right? Which effectively takes in queries that you're building and then allows you to optimize the query generation, so it prioritizes which data sources to query first, and allows you to optimize the queries. And from case studies I've heard from some customers, has allowed them to improve performance, very, very significantly. So I'll keep it to that.
One of the challenges that we've had is I don't think this is probably atypical. Most large companies are probably going to be a little bit slower adopters, and we're no exception to that. So we are just now getting up to 4.0. We completed our 3.1 to 4.0 migration this year, and one of the things we were trying to decide was, well, when do we use multi-source universes? And interestingly enough, part of our decision is made for us because you can't convert a single source universe to a multi-source universe. You have to start from a new development. And given that, and also given that we don't really have a convenient process to convert from universe to IDT, so UNV to UNX, and bring all of our reports along for the ride, we are, during our upgrade from 3.1 to 4.0, pretty much sticking with universe design. Mm-hmm. So that means we don't have a lot of multi-source stuff happening. Now, new development, of course, is immune from those considerations, and we are using IDT in a number of those cases, but we're finding that a lot of the data we want to put together, because we didn't have this feature for so long, we've already pulled it together on a single platform. It's all on Teradata, and then we manage things through schema access rules and security rather than using the plumbing capabilities of business objects. We've got a very few specific cases where multi-source universes are ultimately going to be consideration for us. And it's a really cool idea, and as Eric said, it's the thing we've been looking for 20 years, and now that we've got it, it's like, I don't know.
It's very niche, right?
Yeah, it is.
And I think, and we're in the same boat as Dave, in the fact that we've already started our process of taking the bigger data sets. And the trouble is that we don't necessarily want the users to say, all right, give me everything from over here in this terabyte sucker, and then give me everything from here to terabyte sucker, and I'm going to use Data Federator to combine them together on the business object server. That's just a recipe for disaster for everybody else who's using the server. So we're kind of taking the same route as Dave, and the fact that new development, it's not excluded from new development, and a lot of the people that we're talking about who are using it, believe it or not, it's just because they have their own roll-ups or they have their own kind of groupings or niche market type roll-up data that they want to be able to combine with the larger data set. So those particular discussions are easy enough to have, because you're saying, all right, we're still going to go out on this regular connection anyway, but we're going to combine it and roll it up, against your SQL Server database, which has, combine DB2 with a SQL Server. SQL Server is really a roll-up table of 20 rows. All right, that's easier than saying let's go against this DB2 database and then this DB2 mainframe and combine them all together. That I don't think what it was designed for, although technically it can handle it, but the performance considerations have been a little bit worrisome on our end. So I do like where we're going with it, with the fact of, all right, we're going to look at it for where it makes sense, not necessarily not a niche anymore, but where it really makes sense to combine data that isn't going to be a bad thing performance-wise. So yeah, we got the golden ring there, and we grabbed it, and now we're like, all right, now what?
See,
sorry.
The whole concept of roll-ups, that's what we use Desky for. So I need to duck now.
I'm leaving too. Bye. Go ahead.
I just wanted to to touch on a case study I heard presented in Amsterdam earlier this year by DuPont, and it really highlights, I think, one of the key capabilities of this multi-source universe that maybe some organizations aren't aware that that's possible. So they had a BW system with a whole heap of kind of management data. Then they had 8 production databases that had exactly the same schema, but were one per plant. And so they had 2 requirements. They had to join all 8 production databases, and they had a real low latency requirement, so they couldn't warehouse this stuff. They joined all 8 production databases using derived tables, into kind of one major fact table that spanned 8 sources, then joined it to the BW data, and out of the box it performed like a dog, as you'd expect, right? They then optimized their queries using the Data Federation Administration tool, and using that one universe, they could query one of the plants, and it would know that it only had to query that one database, and they'd get like seconds in terms of query performance. If they filtered for that one plant, it would use that one production database out of 8, even though it was within the derived table, and they'd get the performance. And then if they needed to join it to BW, they still had really reasonable performance. And that was just because they used that Data Federation Administration tool. So that's a requirement that is really difficult to meet otherwise, right? Like you can kind of pull it into a report, but then every time you need a report, you need to generate that whole same thing every time, and that's a real management issue. But using the multi-source universe, they solve their issue. So I think that's a really good case study, and I hope we see more like that presented.
Shameless plug, that was actually our customer in our presentation. But the reality is, that's the example. You don't start with a multi-source universe. You satisfy a specific need with a multi-source universe today. I actually believe in the future HANA's going to change that, but that's not today.
That's a whole other show.
Yeah. So moving us along, 2 more. Mine's going to be a quickie, and that's data object magic. A DBA ingrained in my head a long time ago that never do funky where clause stuff with your dates. Don't try and do date formatting and then date conditions all in the same where clause. And instead, he taught me to develop objects that do all my date calculation off of your system date. So, for example, if I wanted to query for yesterday in a schedule, you would create an object that was the first time slot of yesterday and the last time slot of yesterday. And then if I wanted to look for records that were scheduled in my scheduled report that happened yesterday, I would do where some order date or manufacture date was between that early date and the last date. So the date manipulation you do is always on the system date. There's no impact to the database. We don't have to deal with function indexes or anything crazy like that. But it dramatically increases performance when you're dealing with really, really large fact tables and not trying to do date math at the same time in them. Yeah.
Nope, thumbs up.
So
being conscientious of the time, I'm going to move us to one more. We had more, but these turned out to be really good. So Dave, we've already touched on it briefly, and I know you've got a blog about it. We'll post in the show notes. But your time frame solution, do you want to go into a little more detail about that?
Yeah, sure. In fact, it's a nice follow-on to the date conversation, because that's really what was driving this whole thing. And we'll take this hypothetical huge universe with billions of rows in the fact table, and it's broken down by product, it's broken down by customer, it's broken down, well, the classic who sold what to who and when. Is it who or whom? I don't know. Anyway.
We're nerds, not linguists.
Exactly. And so we were trying to figure out a way to do partitioning and make this thing efficient. And we tried product, and that didn't work so well. We tried the vendor, and that didn't work so well. And ultimately, everything went down to date. And I mentioned earlier that we do everything current year to prior year, and we look at month, we look at quarter, we look at year. So we do a lot of stuff with dates. Now, we're not trying to do fancy formatting at the same time, but we had a date where clause in almost every query. And we had to create all the multiple queries. So the solution I mentioned earlier, the time frame solution, we ended up with a table where the design is basically a list of dates that go into a certain defined range. So week to date, today is Monday, so week to date would contain Sunday and Monday. And it actually contains 2 rows. We tried it with a between, so a start date and an end date, and we discovered that Teradata was much happier if it could do a straight out join. So we bit the bullet and we expanded or exploded that between range from a start and an end to literally a row for every date in that range. And as you can imagine, a year to date in December has a lot of rows, and this calendar table has over 2.5 million rows, I think. But you never use more than 365 at a time. And with a proper index and a join and partitioning and all this other Teradata magic, it worked really, really well. So what then came down to the universe side was, how can we make this work for the users? And it's kind of interesting. I do a lot of stuff with what I call bits in my universe. It's just a 1 or a 0. I use it for character manipulation. I use it for number manipulation. And in this case, I used it for the time frame creation. If you can imagine, if you will, this table with all these dates in it, and I'm only going to be using a selected subset at a time, I have 6 aliases of that table in this simple scenario. 1 for week to date, 1 for month to date, 1 for year to date, and then I have another 3 that are the prior year. And they each have this set of dates in them. I have an object in the universe, which is just the number 1, and it's coming from that one of those 6 tables. And I call it my month to date current year bit, or my month to date prior year bit. And then I create, if you will, a Cartesian product between my measure, call it sales, and these 6 time frame bits. So I have a sales measure by itself, because you always want to give the user the flexibility of using it independently. And then I have what's called a month-to-date sales measure, which has an enforced join between my facts table and my month-to-date time frame. And I have another one called year-to-date, which has an enforced join between my measure and my year-to-date table. Well, how is that join enforced? I take that bit, which is just the number 1 associated with that year-to-date table, and I multiply that bit by the sales. So if you take any number and you multiply by 1, you get the same number back. So the math doesn't really matter, but what it does is give me the ability as a universe designer to set up a unique path for each one of those measures. And then finally, with unique paths, the topic Josh brought up earlier of context versus alias, if I have multiple paths and I set them up in context, and then I make year-to-date incompatible with month-to-date because it's in a separate path, then Webby automatically generates separate SQL. And I mentioned kind of way at the beginning when you asked for our worst horror stories, I have a universe with 1,620 contexts. That's because of the number of facts and the number of time frames. If you take 30 facts times 70 time frames, if they were all used equally, 30 times 70 would be what, 2100 contexts. So you see we've got some gaps where we don't actually fill all of those out. And the beauty of it is I don't maintain those by hand. Ultimately, I have a VBA script using the SDK that when I need to add a new fact table or if I need to add a new time frame, both of those would require me, or even adding a new dimension, because adding a new dimension, I've got to include that join into my context. And I've got a script now that I run, and it takes about 45 minutes to go through and rebuild all of the context. So if it takes 45 minutes programmatically, you can imagine how long it would take manually. But the bottom line is when the user goes in and picks the objects, it is incredibly user-friendly, very flexible. Even with 1,600 contexts, they never once get prompted for a context selection, which is the ultimate goal. And I'm really pretty pleased with the way that universe has been implemented and the way we support it. But very powerful technique. It's a combination of a hack with contexts, aliases. We even have a little bit of aggregate aware mixed in, but I'll leave that for another time.
Well, that was a fun show, and we were at the top of the hour, and we've got to pull it to a close. But I think we could make some other little episodes off of these to maybe give some visuals if you guys want to play some more.
Absolutely.
So, Dave, Derek, thanks for joining us. Josh, thanks for staying awake a little bit later for us.
A lot of fun. Thank you.
And
thanks, Dave. Thanks, Derek.
Leave your ideas in the comments. Let's keep the dialogue going.
Until the next time.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
This podcast is hosted and sponsored by EV Technologies. Visit us on the net at savethecms.com.
D-Slayer!